For this final session, I want to focus on the seminary. And again, my work has been made so easy by this morning's devotion because it speaks about many of the things. There's no doubt that leaders play a pivotal role in the morality of churches. We've seen that in Ephesians in a positive manner. We've seen that in 2 Peter in a negative manner. Bad leaders set bad examples, undermine the church's moral identity, and really set people of God back, destabilizes them, and so forth and so on. And therefore, I don't think I need to convince you that the construction of leadership training programs and schemes which will ensure that the graduates are of the highest moral caliber in themselves and so equipped for the task of moral reformation of the wider community is important. And I say this as a general thing, not only for ministry. In my other life, I am a senior lecturer of a medical school, and the curriculum of our medical school has changed in the last 10 years because one man, a doctor, went about killing patients willy-nilly and was never noticed. Harold Shipman, if you probably have heard the name. He was a mass murderer and a doctor trusted by patients. Some of them through no clear reason. You couldn't tell any other reason for killing these people apart from judging that their lives were not worth living. And all of a sudden we woke up to realize that we have been teaching the wrong side of ethics. We've been teaching our students the debates, ethical dilemmas, which took them nowhere. Instead of teaching them virtues, what it means to be a doctor, what is compassion, what is doing good as a doctor. You will not believe it, but we went wayward, and now this is a very strong ethos in the medical school. Lecturers are supposed to be taught how to do it, and in your just speaking, you are supposed to express compassion, exemplify it as it is for students to learn. So this statement I'm making applies to all, but I'm sure it applies to us even more as people training others. I can only quote Professor Naidu approvingly in this article, and I will come back to her again because she's made at least 3 contributions to this talk. A key indicator of the character of today's Christianity is ministerial formation. It is precisely because of how Christian traditions recruit, train, equip, and morally form their leadership candidates, which may determine the quality and faithfulness towards their calling in Christian ministry. Learning to be a minister encompasses the holistic development of individuals rather than being limited to either the acquisition of knowledge about the faith or even knowing how to behave as a minister. And I think it's bang on correct. That point is well made, but unfortunately, as soon as this is agreed, but as soon as we begin to think about how exactly we go about it, we are faced with a number of challenges, which we may be aware, but we tend not to take them seriously. The first challenge I thought of is the fact that not all our church leaders in Africa have had, will have, and are amenable to acquiring seminary education. And that is a fact, and it's quite a challenge if you're thinking of the moral transformation of people when the pastors themselves are not amenable for training. It's a limitation. I will come back to this point. I hope to come back, but if I don't come back, personally, I think we have a responsibility to broaden our appeal. I am aware there are pressures, and I'm going to mention the pressures, but we exist as one of God's instruments to form the future leaders, as we talked about yesterday. And so we've got to be innovative and thoughtful and intentional in how we insinuate ourselves, more or less make ourselves available at the doorsteps of people who will be excluded, nevertheless, from seminary education, and reach out. And there was the TEE, is it still working well. A TAA was a tool for that, and it's time for us to reinvent it in a way that would address the new crop of leaders and pastors. That is one issue, but it's a challenge to think that a lot of our leaders are not accessible to us. But the second problem is the global theological education itself is undergoing a lot of crisis, which I wouldn't make a lot of now because it's not of immediate concern. But also we have multiplicity of denominations in Africa now, and that can pose a challenge. The ideal is to have a ecumenical type of education, which we are having. But of course, ecumenism brings challenges, surmountable challenges. Nevertheless, there are challenges to be able to be aggressive in formation of people when you know that there are people of different persuasions, denominational persuasions that you are teaching. And then institutional accreditation pressures is a major challenge to us. It's a double-edged sword, as we all know. On the one hand, it increases our sharpness and our ability to stand tall and deliver tertiary education, which is comparable to the world. But on the other hand, there are demands that may be put on us which may diminish our focus on the formation of people. And I bounced into Cheeseman's, what appears to me by angry words the other day. Cheeseman, I don't know where he is now, but I know he's an Irish chap who works with ISET, but his comment is about American teaching, training. He says the American evangelical colleges, in striving for a higher intellectual level, the big thing for them as at this time to be seen to be intellectual, have put less effort into their students' lives. There has been less space in a busy timetable for spiritual activities. The nature of many degrees and postgraduate programs does not require all students to be in at all times of the week, and so daily chapel is harder to arrange, and the sense of importance of spiritual formation has often declined. More subtly, the drawing closer to the Enlightenment attitudes of global academia, we have found it hard to cope with the secular model of higher education it promotes. I can sense his anger and frustration about how things are turning in this. But in there is the evident problem that sometimes aiming for higher academic standards may be seen as countering a desire to form students to be pastors. And then, of course, there are many economic structures, which are financial pressures, which are affecting us. This book, actually, I don't know why they made it so green. It is in your eyes. I'm sure they will not sell much. But it is a very important book because what they have done, Carpenter is the principal of Calvin College in London. You can imagine it's a Baptist training college. And they have really pushing to become a university if they have not always been done so. But what they've been doing is over the last few years, they've been publishing sort of what is happening in private university educations of Christian ethos. They note that there is increasing secularization of religiously founded university in the global south. And so you have universities, and they list universities in Kenya and in Nigeria. I don't know what is happening in South Africa, where they founded with strong Christian principles with the aim of training Christians who will be really Christians in their work. And increasingly secularization agenda has taken over, and they are like any other universities altogether. The worldwide shift of the values of higher education from pursuit of public good to private gain, and that is what is happening in worldwide education, hence tuition fee and all of that. It's no more as it used to be. You are training to serve the community. The government views that you are training to serve yourself. And that is gradually seeping into some Christian education programs. So in all, while the need for formulating agenda for spiritual and moral formation of ministerial candidates is widely recognized, the obstacles for doing so in an effective manner in the current situation are considerable. Even so, some people are doing well. And I want to start with a positive one from Professor Nedu's paper, which is published 5 years ago, and I think is due for a renewal. And what she did is, first of all, she wrote out and validated an index for measuring the students' perception of how their programs are forming them, which is made up of 6 components. Institutional commitment is students' perception, mind you, not what exactly happened, but how the student perceive it. And for some people, perception is reality, because it's the way people see it. That is what it is. That is what some people think. And so the perception to her is a very important measure. The institutional commitment, the specialized services offered by the institution, the formal and informal learning of spirituality, community life, staff and faculty involvement in their spiritual growth. So she did that. And she used the Likert scale, which is often used for surveys, so that, remember, 1 is best and 5 is worst. So students were to grade their perception of these factors. And this involved 7 seminaries, ranging from Anglican to Reform. And then you can see the figure. So remember, the lower marks are better than the higher marks. Total average score was 2.16. In other words, the majority of the students agreed that their institutions had a more positive approach to spiritual formation, which I think was very good to judge by that. In the breakdown, the Pentecostal seminaries had a better view of the programs, which I would expect to be the case. And that was heartwarming. And so also the charismatic and the Baptist group of seminaries.
So the subdivision of Christianity is Pentecostal, Charismatic, and Baptist are one group, and everybody else?
In terms of this study, yes. The other thing she found, which I'm sure you can detect, is that those seminaries associated with universities tended not to be as good. But mind you, the average was good. But I presume the Reformed, for example, are heavily dependent on university, and that is that. Overall, this study demonstrates that formation remains a reasonably strong agenda in South Africa, many institutions in South Africa where Professor Nedu is, even though, well, I'm saying it as if you don't know, you all know her, I presume. Willem knows her, at least, so that's fine. With closest links to secular universities may appear disadvantaged by other factors. Does the drive for a particular type of academic excellence undermine institutional structures and commitment to formation? She raises that question for us to answer. But what we are interested in is formation at a distance, because that is where we belong to. But that's not just that, because that is the way things are going to go, if not already. And I was commenting about this to Kevin the other day. In the UK, many, especially postgraduate courses are blended now. Very few are purely residential. They're all blended because the philosophy now is anything that can be done by distance must be done by distance. There is no point bringing the student in except for occasional contact with the occasion. And that is the pragmatic approach that is taken. So the question is whether we can what is the state of literature about the formation at a distance, forming people at a distance. And I will also propose, I will quickly do a survey of some of the papers which I've done in this, and also propose that one of the deficiency is having a strong biblical basis for that idea of forming people at a distance. And I'm going to propose that the pastoral epistles actually is a model, not only because it serves that purpose, but because you can detect an intentionality, Paul's personal awareness of his absence as a problem, and taking steps to overcome those absence in a way as to form Timothy and Titus and the leaders. And that to me is formation at a distance. It is knowing that my absence is a problem in the delivery of the formation, and yet I must do it, and using the material before me, the letter in this case, in our case, internet, in such a way as it delivers that formation so that the brothers and sisters are not at disadvantage. I can detect quite that in pastoral epistles more than any other of the apostles' letters, which are all sort of at a distance anyway. So scholarship on formation at a distance, and I'm going to whisk through this very quickly. I'll group them into three. Evidence of efficacy. Does it work? Can it be done? And then second, evidence of efficiency. What works and what doesn't work? And then there is a good, reasonable debate about what theological and biblical grounding can we have to support what we do. It starts with Kersley, I think, who sets the agenda, who was very biting in his criticism of formation at a distance. He said the way formation is, the way the biblical language is, you need a bodily presence in order to form people. And that shaped the language from 2002. There were objections. Gresham said, no, Kersley's argument is based on faulty understanding of the human being. And we've had a lot of conversation about anthropology and cosmology. And it is something that I think theology, we haven't taken it seriously. By the way, did you know that for Boltman, his first, when he talked about Pauline theology, his first chapter was on anthropology, which was very interesting because most of us start theology from theology proper. And Boltman starts from anthropology, where you could say that's why he got it all wrong, but there we are. But Hess, formation at a distance has better chance of contextualizing and personalizing the formation. And that is Hess's contribution. And his argument is that if the person is doing it in the usual context, then if you are intentional in the way you form them, they are able to put their growth into practice in that context. So rather than removing them from that context, you may remove them from time to time, actually seeking ways of making sure that they grow in their context, in their daily context, actually is a better model to follow. Even so, the arguments against formation has persisted. The American Theological Schools, which is a very powerful accreditation organization in the US, which accredits programs, they really resisted introducing distance education into their MDiv program with formation programs until 2013. And even in 2013, it was only 3 institutions that they gave accreditation for to do spiritual formation at distance because of how Kelsey's view shaped the scholarship. And then there were those who kept on parroting Kelsey's view in different ways. And here in South Africa, Kumalo and Richardson are Methodists. Have you heard of them before, Jonathan? Yes. They are Methodists. And they argue that ministers with integrated intelligence and imagination can be formed only through intensive residential full-time seminary experience. And that is the view which I think persists in some people. And in the 2015 ATS document, they expressed some view on formation. According to the relevant degree programs, distance education programs shall seek to enhance personal and spiritual formation, be sensitive to individual learning styles, and recognize diversity within the community of learners. This is meant to be sort of a way of saying, if you're going to do it, you do it like the people in the residential. But you read through the lines, and paradoxically, what they are demanding can only be better be delivered by distance. So when I'm speaking as somebody who is biased. But you can't be individualized in a group manner as much as you can individualize in distance education. And so there is a paradox in it, in their way of doing it. Courses shall require regular and substantive interaction between teachers and learners and among learners to ensure a community of learning. And I think that is right, and that is the direction that we should be going, using the tools at our disposal, which is now making the residential educationists quite envious of the tools that we have. This paper, I think, it doesn't fully debunk, but it quietened those who criticized distance learning. And this is a meta-analysis by Brahmi and Co. in 2004, in which they pulled together, it was a meta-analysis of comparing distance education literature, pulled 232 studies published over quite a long period, and they used sophisticated statistical analysis, which, to be fair, I didn't understand half of them, but they proved that they are very thorough in the way they analyzed it. And they found that overall, and remember this is pooled courses, so it's not just theological education, but their findings are helpful. Overall, distance education had only a slight advantage over non-distance education with respect to student achievement. And that is the thing that we ought to think about. When you think about distance education, the more you personalize, the better your student is likely to achieve, because you start them from where they are and you move them to where they could be. And that is the intentionality bit. When outcomes were split, there was a small negative effect for synchronous distance education compared with asynchronous. And I was quite surprised by this. I had assumed that if you do a synchronized, then you probably will have a community of learners learning together. But they found that asynchronous, i.e. everybody at their own pace, apparently produces slightly better advantage over synchronous. The quality of course design is the more important factor rather than whether it's DE or non-DE. So it is intentionality, how you design your course to meet the need rather than the media. For DE, learning activities which foster student interactivity and problem solving improve outcomes. And I think I'm speaking to the converted. Effective DE depends on the provision of pedagogical excellence. Another paper I want you to look at, because it mentions SATs in it, and I was very interested to see what he thought about SATs. Not a lot, he just said it remains to be peer-reviewed. But Nichols did his PhD with the University of Otago, and what he did was, there is an evangelical seminary based, what's the name of it? Laidlaw College. Have you heard of them before? Laidlaw College. And what he did was for 77 students, he compared the formational experiences between the two cohorts of undergraduate students. You can easily do that. Anybody raising their hands to do a thorough study on our students to help the literature. And they compared those who were doing DE versus the non-DE through the same program. And what he found, he used an index, spiritual participation profile, as a way of measuring their growth. So whereas NADO had used perception, he had actually used something to measure more their improvement in spiritual growth. And this seemed to be to be an even more objective improvement on Professor Nadu's work. And there was no significant difference in the experience. But more positively, DE had more church enrichment than non-DE. And so, and it makes sense. They are still situated in their churches. They are Bible study leaders or preachers, and their study is being matched up with what they are learning. And so teaching them where they are seemed to actually enrich the Church of Christ rather than taking them out for a very prolonged time. I will skip that because the basis is that really the thing is not the media, the thing is how you do it. And it can be done is the answer. Does it work? It works. And the evidence is that it may even work better if you use DE, which is sensitive to each individual student. That is my answer to the first question. What about what works? And this, it's a shame I can't go through all this. I'm sure you are relieved that I can't go through all this, but I can send you the almost 70-page of summary that I did on this. The 4 factors, intentionality, I alliterated them: intentionality, interactivity, internet, and instructor. And these are the 4 factors which seem to count. Now, intentionality, Ibrahimi did, and his group did another meta-analysis. Remember that one was 2004. This is a different meta-analysis, and there they wanted to tease out what factors makes DE better. And they said it is intentionality, i.e. the lecturers, the teachers, and this is focused on formation, not on just the education, but formation. It is the lecturers and teachers intentionally forming. In other words, in everything they are doing, that is part and parcel of their reason for doing it. So they write a course structure, they map out, they do the course matrix, and DE and formation was one of them to try and make sure they understand. In fact, White goes further. I probably should list to you White's suggestion because I think it's White. Oh. Yes, I've lost him. But White goes into details about what aspects of intentionality are more enriching than others. There we have caught him. Yes, that's right. It should feature spiritual formation as a course goal. So in each course design, there must be a statement of a goal in which you want to make sure that the student is growing spiritually. It should model a redeemed, the teachers should model a redeemed personality through the course content itself. The teacher should personalize the experiences of the student. In other words, seek ways of interacting with the student, and where you use email, be aware of the way emails can be a tool for good or for bad. And that is not just the way you are writing it, but the way the other person is going to read. Be aware of it, but don't be afraid of it. Use it as a tool of forming, of encouraging. Make sure there is always an encouraging aspect as much as a nurturing aspect to what you say. Promote a safe and nurturing community is what White says. Interactivity, with media, multimedia now, we have no excuse, I think. We just have to use whatever we can. Social networking, streaming of online chapel services. And I think that's very attractive. You know, you may not have, but what about once in a while, one of the teachers putting their sermons on the site? You see, the sermon is a potent tool in forming believers, not just by their content, but in modeling how you, the teacher, you are living out the faith. You are being true to what you are teaching. And therefore, if your students are not seeing you preaching, are not seeing you doing the work of the Lord, they are unsure as to whether what you're teaching is what you practice. And the internet is there for us to make use of it. Create prayer rooms, it says, for example, on the website, so that people are praying and praying about issues. I mean, we had a wonderful testimony from Rob. How about having a prayer room on the SATS website, which is where people, I don't know how it works, I'm sure somebody knows better how it works, but a prayer room is where people connect and pray about issues. The internet has come. And I was commenting to Manu the other day, 3 incidents in the history of Christianity has changed things. First is the Codex, which it seems to be that it was invented by the first Christians. I mean, there were papyruses, but the Christians needed a better mode of transporting the gospel and the scripture, and they invented, or they quickly caught on to it. And instead of writing for pleasure, as the Romans did, they began to write for the people of God. And that was the first thing that they did. And then the second thing was the printing of the Bible. And I think the internet is an opportunity for us to use in a building up of the Church of God, so that we can teach people. There are people in the UK whose daily diet of sermon is from Africa. They may go to church, but in the end, when they sit down, it is the sermon preached by Pastor so-and-so, which they find feeding them. And God has been kind in providing the internet for that. Faculty webinars is another one to build up forums and general synchronous and asynchronous discussion. So interactivity in the internet. And then the teacher, the instructor, plays a primary role. How you model what you teach and how you go out. So what works? We have the information out there, and there is quite a lot of work has been done. But I want to remind you that starting with Kelsey, the gaunt was put to us to prove that there is a biblical theological reason why we should do this by distance education. Why don't we gather them and teach them? And since then, there have been so many people proposing different kinds, and I would not be able to review them. I have found some of them to be difficult to understand. I mean, the incarnational theology is a very good way of talking about it, but it seems to me to apply both for non-DE to DE, so except I have misunderstood it. But there have been various proposals as to that. The closest I have come is White, who has pointed out that in many of Paul's letters, he keeps on talking about his absence. You remember in Philippians, whether I am with you, I am not, so that I might hear that you are growing. And then he talks to Timothy, if I am delayed, that you will know how people ought to behave in the house of the Lord. The apostle, as an itinerant minister, has always been aware of the effect of his absence. But it seems to me, as time went on and he became imprisoned and so forth, he adjusted even more to using the letter as a tool for forming believers. And that White set me off thinking about that. Now, Forrest and Parrott, they have forgotten the title of their paper, but it was very catchy. Unfortunately, the content disappointed me a bit because they said they actually focused on distance learning, and they tried to use the book of Romans to show that Paul was intentionally showing himself as a professor of distance education. I wasn't quite sure how it went. I think we can think of the pastoral epistles as a way in which we can think of giving us a basis for this. We know the pastoral epistles, it was addressed to individuals apart from Philemon's letter. It is a bioptic letters. In other words, it's looking two ways. It's letters to individuals, but at the same time, Paul always had a mind. It's a letter of mandate, has a mind of the people who will be listening. It's distinctive in theological proclivities. It deals with false teaching, deals with church disorder, and proper moral conduct. And we know the context. up to a certain point. We know that there was a syncretistic going-ons of false teaching in the background. But what was then happening was that it was causing chaos. Now, this chaos expressed itself in three ways. First, there was indiscipline in some of the churches. There was more false teaching. And then there was moral misconduct. And the pastoral epistles address these three aspects of the situation in the churches. The question which has been the focus of many people is which of these three is the most important focus of the apostle. Now, Paul needn't have made up his mind that one is more important than the other, but it is a way in which scholars try to come to a more sharper edge of interpreting the letter. The fact is, Paul doesn't directly address the false teaching in a systematic manner. Paul, in some cases, assumes that recipients knew it. And recently, Kostenberger and Wilder have emphasized the theme of stewardship as a controlling metaphor. But the weakness of that is that there is no explicit account of what was entrusted onto them. And clearly, Paul assumed that they knew. What I think ought to be emphasized is that Paul wanted the trusted men. It's the trust. That is very important to him. There must be people who are trustworthy to be able to be entrusted with a trustworthy message. And so I think the moral aspect of these leaders was very important to Paul in the pastoral epistles, having already taught them about what ought to be entrusted to them. Character seemed to me to be the key. Was it the church order? Well, some believe church disorder was a very important thing, and the word pastoral was actually borrowed upon these three letters in the 18th century as a way of capturing that idea of leadership. And the moratorium canon is useful in saying it is a regulation of ecclesiastical discipline. And that could cover morality and disorder. And it's only in the 6th century that Marshall and Towner have drawn our attention. What attracts me is the fact that moral discourse is very, very pervasive. When am I finishing? Sorry, I didn't.
25 minutes.
Okay, that's right. Thanks. What attracts me is the fact that the pastoral epistles are
40 minutes.
40. Oh, right. Oh, I should take my time. Okay, all right then. Thanks then. I'll finish this one and then when we come to discussion. The pastoral epistles are, apart from the letters to James, the most explicit ethical of the New Testament letters. Good works occurs on 14 occasions in these letters, expressing the missionary purpose of Christian morality. Limited extended theological discourses, apart from the faithful sayings that apostle God, and references to moral themes, as I did mention yesterday, apart from this verse. If you take all the subunits, there are moral themes through and through in all three letters. And I could go on and on. This is just for titles, and this is how I diagrammed it there. And the theme, if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. And De Villiers, I think De Villiers is from South Africa. In the pastoral epistles, moral formation is so important that it is regarded by some as the key to their meaning. These letters call on the faithful to seek a sober lifestyle, to avoid extravagance and drunkenness, to be honest, to discipline children, to be faithful in marriage, and to reject various forms of violence. Calls on the faithful. And I think the only modification I will make to that is that it's actually a call on the leaders. It's really having leadership, moral formation in mind, more than the faithful. Well, the faithful also, but it's leader. Paul uses these letters as a way of forming the leaders. It served the function of morally forming Christian leaders serving in a chaotic situation. Pastoral epistles provide us with a first century model of moral formation of leaders at a distance. And I'm now going to discuss how Paul does that through his intentionality in these letters, through his interactivity, and of course through other things that I might point out. So you may remember we said that these are the what works informational. Now, so let's use it and test whether Paul attempts to deal with it. Now, internet, he didn't have it, but the apostle used letter to the best effect. And he was a prolific letter writer. And sometimes you wonder, how does he get a time to write? Why did he bother to write? Well, we know why now, isn't it? Without it, we wouldn't have known anything. And that is what, there is a new book by one professor in Edinburgh, which is titled Christianity as a Bookish Religion. And what he is proposing is that one of the big characteristics of the first Christians is the writing. And in fact, the Gnostics, the Qumranites and so forth, had a few books and hid them. But Christians wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And here we are. And that is his point, as Christianity as a bookish religion. Not bookish in the sense of clever, but people of the book, people who wrote. I would say that there were people who wanted to use every latest media for publicizing their belief at their disposal. And that is actually a better way of putting it. Every time something is available to be able to get a message across, it is time for the Christians to use it. What works? Paul used the latest technology at his disposal, and it boils down to the instructor, and we will not talk about that. But I want to talk about the other two, the intentionality. In what remains, I highlight the insights that these letters may provide for the formulation and refinement of moral formation of Christian leaders at a distance. I focus briefly on Paul's intentional self-portrayal in these letters as a fosterer of formation, and his theological interactive praxis of formation in the letters. Paul's intentionality. That the Paul of the pastoral epistles was intentional in seeking the spiritual and moral growth of his associates and other leaders is plain from every page of these letters. It is the apostle's typical style to be personally immanent in all his letters. He writes as if he is in there speaking through his letters. He was acutely aware of his absence from the recipients and thus saw his letters as substituting for, and in some ways, projecting his presence among the recipients so as to fulfill his pastoral functions. The letters mediated his presence in the community of believers. To put it another way, Paul saw his absence as a problem, but he also understood his letters as playing a role to reduce that problem. He told the recalcitrant Corinthians, though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment. He later tells them again, what we say by letter when absent, we will also do when present. To the Galatians, he writes, my little children, for whom I am again in the pain of childbirth until Christ is formed with you. And then he says, I wish I were present with you now and could change my tone. Paul, as a pastor, was thus very much aware of the unavoidable problem that distance posed to his ministry, and so saw his letter writing as one of the most important means to circumvent this problem so that he will continue his formative activity through the letters. Nowhere is this circumvention as intense as the pastoral epistles. This intensification of the apostolic formative presence through his pastoral epistles is achieved through three devices. First, the literally actualization of his relationship with the recipients, and I'll explain that a bit. It's through the writing, he actualizes his relationship. So they know that this is Paul talking to me in this particular circumstance. His personal appeals of himself as example is another one. And his direct and forceful formational praxis. Timothy, he says it as if he's standing before him. Pursue this, and then he says, I'll quote a few. So we see how he is emotionally present in his letter as a person almost there with them. That to me is intentionality. In all three letters, Paul begins with his general trademark introduction as apostle, and further in titles he adds as a slave of God. It is also his trademark habit to make some telling modifications to his self-introductions and the descriptions of the recipients as a way of establishing the nature of relationships and the concerns of the letter. This again occurs in the pastoral epistles. As one would expect of a letter of mandate, he describes himself not just as apostle, but one by God's command or will, thus underlying his authority, serving under God's authority. And the issue of authority of the distance educator is very important to negotiate. The authority is very important and must not be abused, but must be present in that role so that it generates the confidence in the instruction that you are given. That is for a wider discussion. But balancing authority and fatherliness, as we saw this morning, is a very thin edge. But we've got both and make sure that authority is present. In Titus, he qualifies this even further by stating the moral implications of his appointment. He furthers knowledge of the truth which is in accordance with godliness. The overall picture of Paul in the self-introduction is one who was keenly self-aware of his calling and responsibilities, as well as his authority to foster the transformation which the gospel brings. It is in this light that he describes Timothy as my loyal child and my beloved child, and Titus as my loyal child in the faith we share. And we've had something to say this morning. For Paul, the authority of apostleship was functional. It was the nature, it's the authority to nurture and to foster formation in believers under his care. Inherent in this is a relationship is mentoring. But there is more to it than that. It is a spiritual bond of accountability and mutual blessing of spiritual father and spiritual son. And Paul believed it. It's not just a language is used. He believed it. And he worked at it. This picture is replicated throughout the rest of the letters. But it is even more heightened in 2 Timothy, in which he evidently sees an imminent end to his ministry, and he's anxious so that Timothy will continue. So he speaks, for example, of his appointment as a herald, as a teacher, not ashamed to continue that service and willing to suffer for it. He brings very fond memories to mind, mentioning Timothy's mother and grandmother by names, recalling the younger believer of the shared memories they had in Lystra, in Iconium, in Antioch, and Timothy's own ordination ceremony. He shares his disappointment with the faithlessness of some in 4 verse 10 to 16, his apprehension of antagonism of others, his appreciation with gratitude to some, and his general sense of loneliness. All this is a sharing of life with Timothy. And it's so imminent in this letter. This is Paul at his most vulnerable. 2 Timothy, at his most vulnerable. Such expressions of vulnerabilities undercut the argument of those scholars who see Paul of the pastorals as overly authoritative. No, he saw it as a way of sharing himself with his student. Paul was forming Timothy and Titus through these letters at a distance. At a distance. All these are shared not just as a way of obtaining the sympathy or perhaps the urgent arrival of Timothy back to him, but also as part of an intentional attempt for furtherance of the formation process, of the building of strong formative bond and relationship that allows the authority figure to impart himself to the spiritual son. Through the medium of these letters, Paul actualizes, that's what I mean, he actualizes the bond of close relationship necessary for fostering spiritual transformation in someone at a distance. As a spiritual father, he did not refrain from bearing his soul to these leaders at a distance, if at all through it he might foster more growth in Christ. That is formation at a distance, through building enduring relationships. Timothy's, I think I am out of sync with this, but Paul's personal references to his own experiences, thoughts, his attitudes and habits in his letters are also well known. They personalize his letters, symbolize his presence, and strengthen his relationships. They also serve as formative model for his readers. That the pastoral epistles contain a significant amount of these references, therefore testified to their nature as distinctively designed to form the recipients. So, for example, after charging Timothy to stop the false teachers in Ephesus, Paul narrates how he himself had excommunicated other false teachers in 1:20. After denouncing the false teachers that Timothy is to silence in Ephesus because the result of their teaching was characterized by immoral behavior that does not conform to the gospel, Paul shares a testimony of his own experience of the gospel as a counterpoint and exemplar of what sound teaching achieves. You remember 1 verse 13. I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor and a man of violence, but I received mercy. And that juncture, he talks about it after the excommunication order. He talks about it to talk about how he has been redeemed. And he expects leaders to be also live in that way by which they were redeemed, as a way of reminding Timothy. Paul thus depicts himself as a model of true conversion, which legitimatizes his teaching over and above the false teachers. The exemplar theme is even more explicit in 2 Timothy. Timothy is exhorted to follow Paul's example and not to be ashamed of suffering for the gospel. Just as Paul had been entrusted with the gospel, 1 verse 12, so also is Timothy urged to guard that good deposit entrusted to him, and he to entrust it to other faithful believers. And so the chain continues. Timothy was to share in the suffering of Christ with Paul as joint soldiers. He says that 1 verse 8 and 2 verse 3. And continue in what he had learned as he had received them from from Paul. It is clear that as a lead worker, Paul saw himself as exemplar, whether he was intentional or not. He made that choice to be intentional so as to maximize the formative impact. So he talks about himself, and it's all part of forming the brothers who receive these letters. Where such appeals for emulation are not explicit in the letters, it is still no doubt the apostle's formational intention. For when he, for example, reminds Timothy that you have observed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, when he does that, Paul was urging the partner to emulate his example. Similarly, when he declares, I have fought the good fight. He was not boasting. He was urging Timothy to continue the good fight. So it is a sharing of himself. He is immanent in these letters, and he shares it as a way of guiding Timothy. Paul's intentionally shared his life's joys and pains and successes and failures and his anxieties and aspirations, all as a means of forming Timothy. A third means by which Paul employed the medium of the letter for the moral formation of his associate is through the manner in which he presents his exhortations, prayers, and benedictions for these recipients. This again is characteristic of all Paul's letters. But in the pastoral epistles, there are three different forms in which this takes. Namely, there are those practical exhortations on how they go about performing the duties they have been assigned. 2, there are those direct exhortations, goodwill wishes, and prayers for their moral and spiritual growth. And C, there are citations of the theological maxims and faithful sayings which summarize the faith they shared together. Each one of these contribute to Paul's formational praxis. And I think that's where I was. With regard to the first, we have a lot of passages there that I've set as example. Paul indicates his attention to detail in providing guidance and instructions for their duties. This is not a power-hungry man. This is a man who gives his all to help guide the brothers who are working in his absence, while at the same time leaving room for discretion and self-determination by his associates. But mostly throughout, he throughout, he expresses the concern for these instructions to be performed in the correct moral motivation and dispositions. In this regard, Paul sometimes employs different types of metaphors to generate very compelling and vivid pictures of the nature of the work to which they have been called, such as soldiers and farmers, household utensils, stewards, and athletes. This is a man seeking to form leaders. The second category deals with their personal, spiritual, and moral formation. And that's a lot of passages, and most interesting, for they provide some of the most intimate details of Paul's formative praxis with these associates. He challenges Timothy to watch his conduct, to pay attention to his own spiritual growth, to develop the correct attitude to the opposite sex, to money, and to generally to make progress in his spiritual walk with the Lord. For in doing so, he said, you will save both yourself and your hearers. He charges him to pursue a life of godliness with vigor and to fight the good fight. He describes formation with the athletic metaphor of disciplinary training in godliness. He prays for Timothy night and day, he says, while he remembers his young zeal with fondness, and he exhorts him to fan them into flame. He shows keen interest in Timothy's personal affairs to the extent that he conveys practical medical advice to his protege. He urges, he exhorts, he charges, he encourages Timothy using short, pithy phrases with forceful second-person singular imperatives, especially. All these are acts of a man imbued with love and commitment to intentionally seek the spiritual growth and formation of a leader under his care. And then the third category, I don't know where I am with the slides anymore, but the third category of passages, and that's another long list, these appear to be confessionals, which we have mentioned already. And they are all a way of reminding them, was Peter of their basis. when we come to talk about interactivity, the personal references, the reminiscences, allowed himself to be vulnerable, shares disappointments with the faithlessness of some, apprehension of the antagonism of others, appreciation with gratitude for some, and his general sense of loneliness. They are all ways of sharing himself with them. I think we can soundly regard the pastoral epistles as providing us with a biblical sound grounding for formation at a distance, because there is intentionality in there. It's somebody aware, if I am delayed, as I left you in Ephesus, he tells Timothy, if I am delayed, it is intentionality in there. And he sees it as a tool for forming people who are not present with him. When people demand the biblical foundation of what we do, I think the pastoral epistle is the foundation. What does that mean then for us in our context? And I think I will now actually pull all that we have done together in the last 2 days. I want to say to you that there is a sort of heartwarming thing about it, a perverse heartwarming thing, to realize that the New Testament churches confronted problems of immorality, not unlike us, like us in a way. That's an English way of trying to put the double negatives where it didn't work. But not unlike our times. And so there is a heartwarming thing about it, that we can have an encouragement that it's not irredeemable. And by the grace of God, there is something that we can do and can be done. And through prayer and all those things that we spoke about. The gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ is the answer to immorality in our society and provides hope for the situation before us. Prophetic teaching, we need it. Prophetic teaching, as I understand it, is standing on the word of God and preaching it as it is in a way that nourishes God's people, but always aware of the context to which it preaches into. The context, a discernment of the context in which the word goes. Reformulating church worship and speaking moral formation as a way of building up our brothers and sisters. I've tried to discuss some of the weaknesses of the church, but I've always been aware of the strength of the church in Africa, which we ought to be proud of is the wrong word, but we ought to appreciate and thank God for. Because the health of the global church is not good in many places. And we must be thankful to God for what the freedom we have in the first place, but also the way we have an edge to let the word of God guide us. And it is in going back to the same word and allowing its authority to rule over us. And I pray that this will be so for us. I pray that the Lord will bless all of us. And thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.